Mr. Okafor had been reading for nearly 20 minutes. The lawyer's office smelled like cold air and old paper. I sat with my hands in my lap, my back straight. My parents were at the far end of the table. My mother, Adana, stared at the surface in front of her. My father, Chukwu, looked at the wall behind Mr. Okafor's head. My older brother Emeka and my younger sister Toby sat beside me, both still. Then Mr. Okafor read the beneficiary list. Emeka's name, Toby's name, the family business split between them, the properties divided, the investment accounts distributed. He read to the bottom. He turned the page. My name was not there. Not once. Not in a footnote. Not in any side clause. Simply gone, as though I had never belonged to this family at all. The room held its breath. My father turned to me, his eyes flat and certain. He said, "You made your choices." My mother said nothing. The fire in my chest was enormous. I let it burn quietly, without showing a single flame. Then I said, in a voice so calm it surprised even me, "I won't contest it." Everyone looked at me the way you look at someone who has just said something in the wrong language. Emeka's eyebrows went up. Toby blinked. Mr. Okafor shuffled his papers. My father's expression shifted from cold certainty into something close to confusion. My mother exhaled slowly through her nose. She said quietly, "At least she's being mature." My father nodded once, the way he did when a problem had been resolved to his satisfaction. That nod was the most painful thing in the room. It meant he had already filed me away. Case closed. Daughter handled. I shook Mr. Okafor's hand, collected my copy of the summary document, and walked to my car. I sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes. Then I drove home. Inside my apartment, I locked the door and sat on the kitchen floor and let myself cry in a way I hadn't done since I was a child. Not because of the money, not because of the properties or the business, because of the nod, because of how easy it had been for him, because my mother had called it maturity. When the tears were finished, I sat very still on that cold floor and felt something shift deep inside me. It was not grief anymore. It was something quieter and much more patient. I was not calm. I was calculating. I did not sleep that night. I opened my laptop and went into my email archive. I had kept everything, every family email going back 9 years, organized by year and sender. My father had taught me that habit. I doubted he remembered. I searched for words like inheritance, trust, and your share. Over 3 hours, I built a timeline. 7 years ago, my father had written to me directly during a period when the business was expanding rapidly. The email was long and warm in the way he was only warm when he wanted something. He had written, "You will always have your place in what we are building. When the time comes, your portion will reflect your contribution. That is my promise to you." I had contributed 4 years of unpaid weekend work, accounting help, and 2 client introductions that brought in the company's largest early contracts. I had never asked for payment. I had trusted the promise. I printed the email. I read it 3 times. I underlined the word promise. Then I read it again more slowly and noticed something I had missed before. The email was dated 6 months before a specific event I now needed to investigate. Someone had changed the story at some point, and I had the original version in my hand. 3 days after the reading, my cousin Neka called from a number I didn't recognize. She was 2 years older than me and had always paid attention to things others chose not to notice. She said she was calling from a friend's phone because she didn't want the call logged at home. I sat up straight. She skipped the usual greetings and said, "I need you to know something, and I need you to believe me." I told her I was listening. She said, "They didn't remove you because of disagreements. That's the story they built for Emeka and Toby. The story they needed people to believe." Asked her what the real reason was. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You ask too many questions. You always have. You look at numbers and notice when they don't match. Your father said once that you were the one child he could never fully manage." She paused. "They were afraid of what you'd find if you were ever in a room with the real documents." The call ended shortly after. I sat looking at my phone for a long time. The will had never been about punishment. It had been about fear. And fear, I had learned, always meant there was something worth finding. I returned to my childhood home on a Tuesday morning when I knew both parents would be out. My mother had a standing appointment in town on Tuesday mornings. My father was always at the business office by 8. I still had a key, which they hadn't yet asked back. I told myself I was there to collect the rest of my personal belongings from my old bedroom. That part was true. I also went to my father's study. It was exactly as it had always been: dark wood, shelves of reference books, a desk that was never cluttered because everything had its place. I moved through the room methodically and without rushing. In the far corner, behind a low bookshelf I had never had reason to look behind as a child, there was a small wooden cabinet I did not remember seeing before. It had a brass lock on the front. Through the narrow gap at the top, I could see folders inside, labeled in my father's careful handwriting. Names I did not recognize. Account names, perhaps, or company names. I crouched down to read the labels more closely. I was halfway through the second one when I heard the slow, distinct creak of the front door opening downstairs. I stood up quietly, moved the bookshelf back, and walked to the hallway. It was Amara, the housekeeper, coming in through the side entrance with a shopping bag. She looked at me without surprise. I told her I was collecting things from my room. She nodded and went to the kitchen. I packed a box of books and a photograph, then left. In my car, I wrote down everything I had seen: the cabinet's position, the color of the folders, the partial names I had managed to read before the footsteps interrupted me. 3 labels had been clear: Meriton Holdings, Cedar Creek Asset Fund. A third, partly hidden, had begun with the letters OL. I went home and sat at my kitchen table with a blank notebook, wrote the names at the top of the first page, and searched online. Meriton Holdings appeared in the corporate registry. Registered 11 years ago. Listed director: my father. No mention of it anywhere in the will. Cedar Creek Asset Fund appeared as a shareholder in a logistics company I recognized as a supplier to our family business. Also absent from the will. I wrote the word Y underneath both names and circled it 3 times. There was more wealth than the will showed. I was now certain of it. 2 weeks after the reading, my parents called and invited me to Sunday dinner. My mother's voice was warm and easy, as if the lawyer's office had simply not occurred. No mention of the will. Just, "We miss you. Come on Sunday. I'm making a gussie." I said yes because I needed to be in that house again, and because refusing would have told them too much. The table was set beautifully. My father poured drinks and asked about my work. Toby talked about a trip she was planning. Emeka smiled at the right moments. My mother moved in and out of the kitchen. It would have looked, to anyone watching, like a perfectly ordinary family Sunday. But I had learned to listen differently. My father used the phrase "moving forward" 4 times in 90 minutes. My mother said, "We're still family" twice. They were not making peace. They were building a frame, constructing a picture of harmony before I had a chance to define my own version of events. They wanted the narrative settled before I had finished reading the evidence. I smiled at the right moments and ate everything on my plate. I gave my father no questions. I let him believe the frame was holding. It was during the second cup of tea, when the conversation had softened into talk about a distant relative's wedding, that my father made his mistake. He was relaxed. He had spent the evening confirming what he believed, that I had accepted the situation and was ready to move on. The combination of a good meal and a compliant daughter had loosened something in him. He was discussing vendor relationships when he mentioned, without pausing, a name. "The Cedar Creek account will handle that side of it," he said, and continued his sentence. He finished the thought. Then he registered what he had said. The change in his face was small but unmistakable, a tightening around the eyes, a fraction of a second where his gaze moved to me, and then away. He picked up his tea. He said nothing else. I said nothing either. I kept my expression mild and interested, the way you look when someone describes something that means nothing to you. I asked Toby about the wedding instead. But I had heard it. Cedar Creek. the name from the cabinet folder. He had just confirmed, without meaning to, that those structures were real and active. Hidden accounts were operating outside the will. And my father knew I had just heard him say so. The following week I worked quietly and without rushing. I had names now: Meriton Holdings, Cedar Creek Asset Fund, and a third company traced from a partial label in the registry search, Olufemi Capital Partners, registered 8 years ago with my father as sole director. I cross-referenced each one with a public property registry. Meriton Holdings owned 2 commercial properties in the city. Cedar Creek appeared as a shareholder in the logistics supplier I recognized. Olufemi Capital held a land parcel outside the city, registered 6 years ago. None of these names had appeared anywhere in the will. The will had covered the family home, 3 visible investment accounts, and the business shares. What I was looking at in these public records was a separate financial world, constructed carefully over many years, running quietly alongside the visible one. The properties in the will were real, but they were not everything. They were the surface. These other structures existed underneath, deeper and quieter, outside the reach of the document that had removed my name. I did not feel triumphant. I felt something steadier than that. The specific calm of someone who has just found solid ground under very cold water. I kept all my notes in a plain spiral notebook that I locked in a box under my bed. My Aunt Ngozi contacted me on a Wednesday evening. She was my father's older sister, a retired accountant, and had always been kind in the way of someone who sees more than they say. She arrived and sat in my living room with the stillness of a person who has been preparing a conversation for a long time. She said she had been uneasy since the reading. She loved her brother, but had watched the family structure shift over years in ways she didn't understand. Then she reached into her bag and took out a brown envelope. Inside was a document, 4 pages, dated 14 years ago. It was a family asset trust, set up in both my parents' names, intended to formalize the distribution of wealth across all 3 children equally. It had been witnessed and signed. My name was listed, not as a secondary beneficiary, as an equal third trustee alongside Emeka, with rights to information, oversight, and eventual distribution. Aunt Ngozi had found it while helping my father organize old paperwork and kept a copy because something told her to. She set it on my coffee table. I looked at my own name printed there in black ink. I always thought the will was strange, she said quietly. Now I think I understand why. I took the trust document to Mrs. Adiz IB, my accountant, a careful woman who had handled my finances for 6 years. I did not explain where it came from. I simply asked her to read it. She read it twice without speaking. Then she removed her glasses. This is a properly executed family trust, she said. It names you as co-trustee. That is a legal position, not a symbolic one. I asked whether the current will could override it. She said the will distributed estate assets, but a trust was a separate structure. Assets inside a trust did not automatically form part of an estate. They were governed by the trust deed, not the will. She asked if I knew what assets had been placed inside. I told her I wasn't certain yet. She looked at me steadily. Someone restructured this family's finances over many years. The question is whether they restructured around this trust or simply forgot it existed. I drove home slowly. I thought about the folders in the cabinet, Cedar Creek at dinner, my father's certainty on the morning of the reading, and I wondered for the first time if that certainty had been built on an assumption he had never once stopped to verify. I met with a lawyer named Mr. Babatunde Coker on a Friday morning. He came recommended by Mrs. IBE and had a reputation for being precise and discreet. His office was small and unhurried. I brought copies of everything: the trust document, the 7-year-old email, my notes from the registry research. He spent 40 minutes reading. Then he sat back and said carefully, "The will your parents filed is legitimate. It distributes the assets listed within it. Challenging it on emotional grounds would be difficult." I nodded. He continued, "However, the will is not the only document of relevance. A trust of this kind, properly executed and witnessed, creates a separate legal obligation. If assets were placed inside this trust, They are governed by the trust deed. The will cannot reach them. He paused and tapped the page. The will isn't the real power document here. The question is what sits inside this trust, and whether anyone in your family understood that you, as co-trustee, have the right to find out. I looked at my own name on the page. I had walked into a lawyer's office weeks ago feeling erased. I was sitting in a different office now, and the picture was not erasure. It was something I had simply not yet finished reading. My mother called on a Sunday afternoon. She sounded tired in the way she only sounded when performing tiredness for effect. She said she had been thinking about me constantly, hadn't been sleeping, that everything was weighing on her heart. Then she began to cry. Not loud crying, just a soft, careful sound. She said, "We did this for your own good. You've always been so independent. We didn't want the business to cause problems between you and your siblings." I said very little. I asked if she was all right. I said I appreciated her calling. After the call ended, I sat on my couch and looked at the wall. I knew what this was. My father used logic. My mother used love, or the performance of it. Together, they had always been enough to make me doubt my own perceptions, to make me apologize for noticing things, to make me smaller than I actually was. I opened my notebook and wrote the word guilt in capital letters. I drew a box around it. Underneath, I wrote, "This is a weapon. Do not pick it up." Then I closed the notebook and put it away. There was work still to do, and guilt, I had decided, was not going to be any part of it. 2 weeks later, Mrs. IB called and asked me to come to her office. She had been tracing the trust document's registration history. She turned the page to face me. The trust had been renewed periodically, as dormant structures often were. But in the renewal records, something had been formally added 11 years ago, a schedule of assets, listing what had been placed inside the trust. 3 items. A commercial property I recognized as an early family business location, supposedly sold years ago. A shareholding in Olufemi Capital Partners. And a cash endowment that made me look up from the page and blink. Mrs. IB let me sit with it quietly. Then she said, "These assets were formally moved into this trust 11 years ago. They are governed by the trust deed, not the estate." She folded her hands. "And the trust deed names you as co-trustee." I read my name on the document again. My father had signed this schedule himself. He had placed these assets inside a structure that gave me legal authority and then had either forgotten he had done so or had hoped I would never find out. I closed the folder and looked out the window. Both of us understood exactly what this meant. I did not call my parents. I told no one except Mrs. IB and Mr. Coker what I had found. I went to work each morning and came home each evening, behaving exactly as I had been behaving for weeks, like a woman who had accepted a difficult situation and was quietly getting on with life. This was the most important thing I could do, because I knew what would happen if my father sensed a change. He had restructured this family's finances once before, carefully and without announcement. If he believed I had found something, he would do it again, faster, with lawyers who knew exactly which levers to pull. The dormant trust was powerful, but only if those assets were still inside it. If my father moved them before I acted, I would have a historical document and nothing else. So I kept my voice easy on the phone. I answered my mother's messages with warmth. I attended one more Sunday dinner and listened to my father discuss the business with his usual confidence. He had no idea I had become a different kind of audience. I was not his managed daughter anymore. I was the co-trustee of a structure he had underestimated. And beneath the stillness, very carefully, I was beginning to move. The family's performance of Unity lasted about 6 weeks before the seams began to show. It started with something Emeka mentioned almost casually. My father had proposed giving him a larger management role while reducing oversight. Toby had pushed back. My father had sided with Emeka. Toby went quiet in the way she went quiet when genuinely hurt. Over the following 2 weeks, I heard the same story from different angles. Toby texted me once. "Did you know about the new arrangement?" I replied that I had heard something. She did not respond for 3 days. Then she called and said, more directly than she had ever spoken to me about family matters, that she was beginning to wonder whether the will was really about protecting the family or one particular version of it? I did not answer that question, but I kept the call. The cracks my father had engineered into my exclusion were now spreading sideways into the family he had intended to keep intact. The unity he had constructed had always depended on everyone accepting their assigned position without looking up. The moment one person looked up and sideways, the whole structure became visible for what it was. Not a family arrangement. A control system. My father called on a Thursday evening. He did not begin with warmth or pleasantries. He said my name once, then said, "I've been told you've been asking questions. About accounts." His voice was controlled, but underneath it was a specific frequency I had learned to recognize. It was the frequency of a man who didn't know how much the other person knew, and who was using confrontation to find out. I said I had been doing some routine financial research. He said, "I need you to be very careful about that." I asked what he meant. He said, "Lawyers and accountants have a way of making simple family matters complicated. I'm asking you not to go down that road." I said I would keep that in mind. He said, "Good." Then, before ending the call, he added, "This family does not need any more disruption." It was framed as a statement. It was a warning. I thanked him and said goodnight. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment after the line went quiet. A man who is simply hurt does not warn you to stay away from lawyers. A man who is protecting something does. He was scared, not of a family conflict, of something specific I had found, or was about to find. Mr. Coker filed the necessary paperwork on a Monday morning. As co-trustee of the Family Asset Trust, I had the legal right to formally assert that position and request a full accounting. He moved carefully, notifying the relevant parties through proper channels, establishing my standing without aggression. By Wednesday, the trust was active in my name. The commercial property in the asset schedule was confirmed as still held within the trust. The supposed sale years ago had been an internal transfer, not a market transaction. The Olufemi Capital shareholding was intact. The cash endowment had grown through 11 years of compounded returns. Mrs. IB walked me through the figures on Thursday afternoon. I sat across from her and looked at the numbers on the printed page. My portion as co-trustee, with equal rights under the deed, was not symbolic. It was substantial, considerably more than the total value of everything distributed in the will. I had not stolen anything. I had not manipulated anything. I had found what had always been mine and used the legal tools my own father had signed into place. The assets began moving through the proper processes, legally, cleanly, with full documentation. Quietly, the way still water moves when you finally tip the container. The first sign of change came through Emeka. He called on a Friday, his voice missing its usual smoothness. He said the external auditors had flagged some accounts in a routine review. They had found references to the Olufemi Capital shareholding and had questions about its relationship to the main business accounts. My father had apparently spent 2 hours in a closed meeting and emerged looking, in Emeka's exact words, like he had aged 10 years in a single afternoon. Toby texted me the same evening, asking if I knew anything about what was happening. I said there were some trust matters being clarified through proper legal channels. She asked if I was personally involved. I said I was, as was entirely my right. She did not respond for a while. Then she sent a single word. Good. The business itself was not in danger. No one was accusing anyone in a courtroom. But the structure of assumed control my father had built over the years, the one that depended on everyone playing their assigned position without question, was no longer stable. He was discovering that a foundation built on other people's ignorance develops cracks the moment one of those people starts reading. They came on a Saturday morning without calling ahead. I saw my father's car from the window and went to make tea before answering the door. When I let them in, my father looked around the room the way he assessed a business situation. My mother sat on the couch with her bag in her lap. My father remained standing. He said, without introduction, "You've been working with lawyers. You've activated something you don't fully understand." I set 2 cups on the table and sat across from them. I said, "I understand it quite well." He said I was making a mistake, creating conflict where none needed to exist. He said the trust was an old document never meant to be used this way. His voice had the quality I had sat across from my entire life, a man explaining to a child how something works. It was a voice that had always, until recently, made me feel smaller. I looked at my father. His jaw was tight. His hands, usually very still, moved slightly at his sides. He said, "You're plotting against your own family." I picked up my tea. I said, "I'm not plotting against anyone. I'm reading the documents that have my name on them." He had no answer for that. The meeting ended without resolution. At the door, my father turned and said there would be consequences. I said I hoped there wouldn't be. He left. I washed the teacups. That same afternoon, I called Mr. Coker and asked him to prepare a formal communication to my parents' legal team. He drafted a letter that was 3 paragraphs, factual and courteous. It stated that I had assumed my legal role as co-trustee of the Family Asset Trust, that I was acting within my rights under the trust deed, and that I was prepared to engage in a transparent accounting process with full cooperation. At the bottom, I added 1 sentence of my own which Mr. Coker reviewed and approved. It read, "The will, as read on the date of the reading, concerns the distribution of estate assets. The trust operates independently of the estate. These are separate matters." That was the truth they had hoped I would never understand. The will had been a performance of authority. It had looked like the complete picture. They had removed my name from it with the confidence of people who believed the document they controlled was the only document that mattered. I had let them believe I accepted that. Now, quietly and formally, in writing, I had told them it was not. My parents' lawyers sent a response within 5 days. It was longer than Mr. Coker's letter and considerably less courteous. It argued that the trust was dormant and had never been formally activated in the required manner. It suggested my interpretation of my co-trustee role was legally overstated. There was a section questioning whether the asset schedule attached to the trust had been properly executed. Mr. Coker read it and set it down with the quiet of someone who is not worried. He said, "They're arguing technical procedural points because they have no substantive argument." He then walked me through each objection and explained why none would hold under the relevant statutes. The trust had been properly renewed. The schedule had been signed by my father and correctly witnessed. My appointment as co-trustee was clear. The assets had not been validly removed from the trust structure. He said, "They're trying to revise the situation using paperwork. But the paperwork that exists was created by your father. They cannot now argue against his own signatures." He filed a response the following Monday. It was 4 paragraphs. Each one was a closed door. The revision my parents had hoped to make was already too late. Mr. Coker called on a Wednesday and asked me to come to his office. When I arrived, he had a document on his desk I had not yet seen, a valuation report from the trust's independent assessor, covering all 3 assets in the schedule. The commercial property had appreciated significantly over 11 years. The Olufemi capital shareholding had grown through reinvested returns well above its original figure. The cash endowment had compounded quietly into a different kind of number entirely. Mr. Coker set the page in front of me and let me read it without comment. The total figure was the kind that changes the shape of a room. I sat with it quietly. Then I said, "This was never in the will." He said, "No, it was never in the will." I said, "They removed my name from the will, and none of this was in it." He folded his hands. "Your father built something separately over many years and placed your name on it as co-trustee. He either forgot he had done so or assumed you would never find it." He looked at me carefully. The real inheritance was never listed. It was always here, and it has always legally been partly yours. The shift in the family was not loud. That should not have surprised me. I had grown up in a family that handled serious business quietly. The power had always moved without announcement. So the collapse of my father's control structure happened the same way. He stopped calling. My mother's messages became shorter and then went silent. Emeka called once, and at the end he said, "I didn't know everything," and I believed him. Toby came to my apartment one evening with food, and we sat for 2 hours talking around the edges of things the way sisters sometimes do. My father had built his authority on one assumption, that each of us knew only our own piece, that no one had the full picture, and that as long as he held it alone, he held the power. It worked perfectly as long as everyone stayed in their assigned position. The moment I stepped outside mine and started reading, the system began to fail. Not because I was aggressive, but because the structure was fragile. It had been built on the expectation of my ignorance. It could not survive the moment I stopped being ignorant. A system that depends on one person's blindness cannot outlast the moment that person opens their eyes. 6 months after the reading, I sat at a desk in a small office I rented with my own money. The trust matters were largely settled. The legal processes had done what they do when documents are clean, moved forward without drama. I had not destroyed my parents. I had not taken Emika's share or Toby's. I hadn't needed to. The documents had said everything, in language that could not be argued with. I thought about the lawyer's office, my father's nod, the terrible ease of it. I thought about my kitchen floor and the 11 minutes in a parking lot. I thought about Aunt Ngozi, our brown envelope, Mrs. IB, Mr. Coker, and the spiral notebook in its locked box. I thought about every question I had not asked at that table, every reaction I had swallowed, and how each of those silences had become a room I eventually walked into with a key. My parents had removed my name from the will. They had expected that to be the end of a sentence. It was, instead, the beginning of one. They had not erased me. In trying to, they had shown me exactly where to look. They removed my name from the will and accidentally removed themselves from my life.